we started each session, whether we were in Florida, California, or Texas, with a 6 a.m. bus ride in which we got all these officials from Washington and state capitals on the bus, school bus, and brought them out to see the area in which they were going to hear from people and see the area where people worked. And in every case, from California, which is the best, theoretically the best system we've got in this country, to Florida and Texas, which are perhaps some of the worst, the officials got sprayed by pesticides every morning that we took them out. This wasn't planned on our part, but it's a reality in these areas that the ability to control and target where pesticides go is very difficult, very difficult. So it was a good way to generate immediate sensitivity on the part of these folks, because the first thing they asked for when coming off the bus was, can we go back to the hotel and change our clothes and wash? And we said, no, you really can't do that. The folks that are working out there live in this stuff, and we want you to have the whole experience of the day. So we actually didn't do that, but people did want to change their clothes and wash, and were concerned and became, I think, sensitized. I think part of the problem we're having with this issue is that people are disconnected from the reality. The people that are writing laws, writing regulations, are disconnected from the reality of what people experience on a daily basis. And I think on another level, the public believes that because pesticides are registered by EPA, this is one of the serious myths we face today, because they're registered by EPA, then they must be safe or must have been tested, and some judgment as to safety must have been established. For those of you, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but for those of you who aren't familiar with the pesticide situation, from what we've heard in this conference, you can see immediately that scientific issues are emerging issues. The estrogenic issue is emerging. And as these issues emerge, chemicals that are in the environment have not been subject to the testing that we believe should go on to make good scientific judgments. Now, it's not just in the estrogenic area where data is simply emerging and the link between breast cancer and pesticides is being established. In the neurological area, the protocol for testing hasn't been well established at EPA. In the immune system area, AIDS-like effects, the pesticides, despite the fact that it's known that many of them cause immunological effects, has not been instituted. So the question marks associated with what we know, or should know, about these pesticides is extreme. Meanwhile, they're in wide use. We're using about 1 billion pounds of pesticides annually in this country. 1 billion pounds of what they call conventional pesticides. Those are the insecticides, the herbicides, the fungicides. About 1 billion pounds a year. That includes agriculture, which is about 800 million pounds, and the rest of it being home and garden and commercial use of pesticides. And there's another billion pounds of pesticides which fall into the category of disinfectants. Lysol, for instance, is a pesticide. It's a disinfectant. A lot of hospitals use disinfectants, sterilization materials, and wood preservatives, which is a huge category, and sulfur, which is also agricultural use. So together we're talking about 2 billion pounds of pesticide use a year, which is a huge amount. Now, just to dispel the notion that we're talking about an agricultural issue, I should tell you that studies have shown that the actual volume of use, the concentration of use relative to the acreage is higher in urban, suburban areas than it is in agriculture. Corn gets about 3.5 pounds per acre, and a common lawn that follows the Scott's program on the back of your weed and feed bag gets about 9 pounds per acre on a lawn. A golf course is as high as, could be over that, 9, 10. I guess lawns are about 4 to 8, 4 to 9, and golf courses go even higher than that. Again, based on the recommended application rates that are on the directions. So exposure to pesticides is something that is both an urban and a rural issue. It's both an ag and a non-ag issue. Now, we all relate to pesticides whether we like it or not, and I think this is to some extent one of the things we need to confront on a daily basis, is that there's involuntary exposure. We can't control. It's not as if we could, and we have to talk about this, come up with an action plan in which we could keep pesticides out of our lives. We can do certain things, and we really ought to talk about what we can do in our communities, what's being used in our schools, what's being used in parklands, parks and recreations, public buildings, areas that we can control. And we should talk about action strategies that we can develop in our own communities to reduce and eliminate use of pesticide. But the reality is that there's a tremendous amount of involuntary exposure. It's in air, it's in the air we breathe, we go into buildings, it's in the air, it's in food. If we don't have access to organic food, and we'll even talk about some of the problems with organic food that ought to be corrected. But for the most part, a lot of our exposure is involuntary. There are studies that show, for instance, pesticides used in agriculture on the West Coast drift to the East Coast. They're literally picked up by rain clouds and deposited in the form of rain or any deposition of water out of the sky, which could be mist or what have you. So from the standpoint of public involvement, public policy, there are a lot of good reasons for us to get extremely activated on this issue. Back in 1993, the National Academy of Sciences put out a report called Pesticides in the Diets of Infants and Children. And they showed in that report, or said in that report, that children are more sensitized than adults to pesticides, or more sensitive and vulnerable to pesticides. The reason for that is children have smaller bodies, and the ratio of chemical to body weight is higher in a child. Secondly, children have developing organ systems and don't have the capability in many cases to metabolize the materials. And their neurological systems are more vulnerable given the developing nature of that organ system. So the fact was established that we had established a vulnerability among a population group, and yet the regulations, the methods of controlling the use patterns did not reflect and does not reflect those vulnerabilities. Now the same can be said for others, people that work around pesticides and have had a traumatic exposure or a low-level exposure over a period of time become sensitized. And what you referred to is known in the medical literature as multiple chemical sensitivity. You have been exposed to neurological poison, a nerve poison, and then your body becomes sensitized to future exposure to toxins. So you may react to a residue on a food commodity that others may not react to because your body's become sensitized. That is not taken into account in the calculation of pesticide use. This is all really part of a discussion of risk assessment, and we've heard that phrase brought up a lot, but the reality is if you march down to a community meeting or a PTA meeting, the first thing you're confronted with is the fact that what you're challenging in terms of the use of those pesticides are really pesticides that are registered by EPA, getting back to my first point. And so you've got to be armed with a clear understanding of what the limitations of that registration process really mean, what those limitations mean. The limitations go to not only the issues you've heard about in terms of inadequate testing for estrogenic effects, I mentioned neurological, immunological, immune system damage, but they go to the issue of whether we're actually taking into account the vulnerabilities of people. If someone's already had cancer or has had breast cancer, that person may be more vulnerable than someone who doesn't to yet another carcinogenic exposure. The question of risk assessment really is whether we ought to be protecting the averages, whether we ought to be protecting people who fit into the calculation of the average adult white male who's 150 pounds and eats certain food patterns. We don't all fit into those averages, and we have different histories, different backgrounds. We live in neighborhoods we've consumed that are different. We've consumed different levels of toxic materials. So the risk assessment methodology is extremely limited in terms of what it tells us. Now, in fact, years ago, when risk assessment came on the scene, the guy who sort of was overseeing EPA at the time, William Ruckelshaus, said risk assessment's like a tortured spy. If you torture it long enough, it will tell you anything you want it to tell you. And at that time, it was really believed to be something that you sort of did to give you a sense of what the policy implications were of what you were doing, but you didn't hold it up as a scientific standard that sort of established a bright line. You didn't hold it up as it's being held up today, as our ability to register a material to protect, as they say, if you read press clippings or go to these press conferences, as they tell us, only one person out of 1 million will get cancer as a result of exposure to this carcinogenic pesticide. The reality is they're not testing for vulnerable people. They're not testing multiple chemicals. Grapes, for instance, have about at least 10 cancer-causing pesticides registered for use in the production of grapes. Apples have a similar amount, as do tomatoes. We are hit with multiple carcinogenic exposure, just to use cancer as an example, on individual commodities. Then we walk out our front doors or send our kids to school and they're exposed to those very same chemicals, not through the diet, but through ambient air or direct exposure. So risk assessment is something that we really need to focus on clearly as a tool to explain to communities that what is widely available in the marketplace, what is widely conducted or accepted as conventional pest management, really ought to be open to public scrutiny and question. The question came up yesterday in the hearings that we had at the City Council chambers, sort of, when should a regulatory agency act to protect us? Do we have to wait till all the dead bodies are piled up? Do we have to wait till all the scientific studies are completed? When should we, in our own homes or in our communities in which pesticide decisions or pest management decisions are being made, when do we have enough information to act, and when can we ask our public officials to act? And the point I'd like to make is that we shouldn't engage in a cause and effect debate on this, because there is science on every side. You've got industry scientists, you've got academic scientists. But what we need to talk about in our communities are issues of the rates of cancer that we're seeing: breast cancer, childhood leukemia, childhood breast cancer, the epidemiological studies that show correlations between farmers' use of pesticides and elevated rates of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Some of the information we passed out in the facts and figures today in the session. We need to point to the patterns of illness that we see and are well documented in the scientific literature, and then ask the question, do we want to contribute or possibly contribute to continued patterns of illness, or do we want to take steps that can prevent or avoid or lessen the toxic burden that contributes to these illnesses, or even could contribute to these illnesses? One of the most important points, I think, to bring up in this discussion is the question of unknowns, the questions of vulnerability, the questions of inadequate testing, the questions of lack of information that accompanies a pesticide registration. So the fact that it is legal and widely in use is not justification for use in those situations. There are a lot of unanswered questions, and there are a lot of questions that won't be answered for a long time. Let me give you an example, just to hone in on the food safety issue. Any policymaker, any scientist in the regulatory arena will tell you need two pieces of information to make a good decision on the use of toxic chemicals. One, you need information on toxicity. You need all the information Anna Soto's talking about, toxicity. The other is you need exposure data. You need to know, what are people really exposed to? If there's a toxicity, if the chemical's toxic but there's no exposure, the thinking goes, and there's no reason for action. Well, in the food safety area, it turns out that EPA has very poor data on food consumption patterns, and has even worse data on consumption patterns broken down by ethnic groups. And so, in effect, what I'm looking at here is a memo, March '95 from EPA, in which they indicate better food consumption data are needed, adequate sample size for specified age groups for children in surveys, identify and quantify more specifically the foods most frequently eaten by children, standardize intake data and survey methodology, coordinate surveys among organizations to examine trends. And they go through an elaborate discussion of the need for better food consumption data, which, remember, is one of the key elements necessary to determine whether what we're eating today is safe. And at the end of saying, well, we need to develop these new data collection mechanisms, they say, at this time, however, the funding necessary to fully implement these surveys has not been obtained. The money is not there to collect the data that will be necessary to answer questions of the reason they're focusing on children is they're trying to respond to that National Academy of Sciences report. So in effect, they're admitting that the ability to do risk assessment relative to food safety is limited. And I can assure you that the very same questions exist in terms of lawn, home, and garden, in terms of structural use in the schools, termite control, cockroach control, rodent control. Go down the list. There's virtually no data on exposure in terms of what is left behind after an exterminator leaves your home or leaves a school. What residue, over what period of time, what inhalation rates, what ambient air content, how much are children breathing in, what impact will occur to them, what kind of vulnerabilities are established early in life that might result in breast cancer later in life. Exposure data is extremely limited. So next time someone stands up and says, EPA does risk assessment, they've calculated that people are adequately protected, that needs to be challenged and needs to be challenged significantly.
Jay, quick question. For pesticides, are they still using inhalation for pesticides in the calculation of risk? Because there's been a real move, I know from the grassroots level, to look at ingestion as the key factor, the key way that we absorb these things into our bodies. I was wondering if inhalation is still prioritized and whether they're moving toward ingestion.
Well,
Food chain effects.
in terms of animal studies, we test pesticides on laboratory animals and try to extrapolate to human. They do inhalation, they do dermal, they do ingestion. The problem, of course, is that they do most of the testing is used for purposes related to food exposure, food residue exposure, pesticide residues on food. The amount of data, non-dietary exposure data vis-a-vis inhalation, is extremely limited at this point in terms of what exposure occurs. But in terms of the protocol and what is tested, there are a range of protocols that affect both inhalation, all three factors, which are, by the way, the rats of exposure. We either inhale it, it gets on our skin, we absorb it, or we ingest it. Those are the rats of exposure. I don't want to talk much more except to lay out the alternative side of the argument here. And maybe to start this, I should read a quote that I read yesterday that comes out of the U.S. General Accounting Office, which is the investigative arm of Congress. When Congress wants to investigate an issue, it asks the GAO to do this. So in May of this year, they issued a report which is called Pesticides, Options to Achieve a Single Regulatory Standard. That's the study. They concluded, and I'm quoting, because scientific data are not always adequate to quantify risks and benefits, the choice of an appropriate regulatory standard entails value judgments and is ultimately a policy decision, which means that we all should be making the decisions. If the unknowns are such that science can't answer the questions that we need answers to, then we all have to weigh in what the GAO has characterized as a policy or political decision. And I can assure you, the chemical companies are weighing in on a daily basis. The agricultural, agribusiness, agrochemical structure, as it affects pesticide users, are weighing in on a daily basis. But the public is not weighing in. The people who are victims, the people who are survivors, are not weighing in on a daily basis. So what this all comes down to is, let's say, we leave this conference and we feel empowered to speak out and to do something. What it comes down to is our ability to bring forward information on alternative strategies. Whether it's a family decision as to whether we should have monthly extermination in our home, or how we should handle the use of disinfectants around the home, or what we should do for cockroaches, whether it's a family decision or whether it's a decision that's made in the schools or on the ball field related to pesticide use, or by the state highway department and their use of pesticides along roadsides. These are ultimately political decisions. The science supporting those decisions is extremely weak right now. So we have an opportunity, I think, to engage in these debates and these decisions on a daily basis in our communities. That's what's exciting. I think that's what gets me excited about this issue, that when confronted, I have seen in community after community good discussions on strategies for school pest management, strategies for rights of way along highways and so forth, and other strategies in the community. And that's what I think we need to use our outrage. We need to put our outrage into that kind of activity. The other activity we really need to get involved in is political, in terms of what our politicians are doing and what our regulators are doing. It's really important, mostly because it's important because the world we live in is a world that thrives on response to vested interests, and it's usually vested economic interests, as you all know, in Louisiana, more so than any other state. And so we have got to do a much better job as the public in getting our friends and families, opinion leaders in our communities, clergy, local elected officials like the state legislators that have been participating in this event, to weigh in on the policy issues of the day. One of the major policy issues of the day in Washington right now is whether they should repeal the Delaney Clause, which is a provision in federal food safety law that prohibits the introduction of cancer-causing pesticides into processed food. Processed food is anything that is not a raw agricultural commodity. Oranges are raw agricultural commodities. Orange juice is a processed food. Tomatoes, obviously canned ketchup and sauces are all processed. The effect of the provision is to stop the use of carcinogenic pesticides, and the industry obviously wants to see that reversed and has a very receptive ear in the current Congress. And so we have, in that fact sheet you've got, HR 1627 is a law that would repeal the prohibition on cancer-causing pesticides. It's a very clear issue. It's an issue I think that we should all feel very strong about, given the nature of this conference and the problems we're seeing with potential problems with breast cancer, the patterns of illness with breast cancer, that we have an opportunity to zero in on a very clear-cut issue. They want to allow cancer-causing pesticides in our food. Now, this issue has come up in a lot of other contexts because the people in power today in Congress realize that there are many avenues. There are a lot of ways to skin a cat. There are many avenues for them to get their agenda through. One avenue is directly attacking a piece of legislation, like the Delaney Clause. The other is to put other requirements on government through this regulatory reform you've heard about that Bennett Johnston's behind. Put other requirements on EPA that what they call super mandates, which prohibit them, basically make them incapable of carrying out the law by super mandating risk assessment, risk-benefit calculations over and above all other laws. The Delaney Clause, which says no carcinogens in our food, doesn't allow for that kind of manipulation of politics with a risk-benefit analysis. So regulatory reform and Senator Johnston's bill, S343, is something we all can clearly fight against, and this is a critical period to do it because it's before the Senate right now, and it's being held up over some a special vote over whether they can cut off debate on this issue, and they haven't been able to get a vote to cut off debate, so they haven't been able to vote the bill. The third thing that we all have to watch for, and as we get ourselves activated and people in our community activated, is something called the appropriations process. And this is where Congress decides how much money to give different programs. You know, first they pass what they call authorizing legislation, which establishes the program. It sets up the Delaney clause. Then they have an appropriations process, which commits the monies to carry out and enforce the Delaney clause. So they're using, and Congressman Livingston's very involved with this, they're using the appropriations process to deny EPA the funds necessary to enforce the law. And literally prohibiting the use of any monies to enforce the law. So the attack is on, folks. I mean, it's always shocking in many ways to come to Louisiana and see what goes on in communities and the kind of exposure people experience in Cancer Alley and so forth. But then to see the insensitivity of what goes on at the policy level to people's real experiences is quite astounding. And somehow I think we have to join together and get people in our communities to realize the threat. And I think we have an opportunity to go out beyond the communities that are affected. I'll leave you with this thought, and something I think we need to build toward. And that is, people have to begin to understand that their choices in the marketplace, whether they live in Cancer Alley or not, affect what goes on here, affect what goes on in communities where farm workers are exposed to pesticides. If I buy conventionally produced food in the marketplace, I am supporting a form of agriculture that relies heavily on pesticides. I am contributing to the poisoning of those workers out in the field. So I make a political statement when I buy organic food, or try to reduce or eliminate the use of pesticides in my own life or in the community. And I think increasingly as we go out into communities that don't see the directness of exposure to their own lives, that we have to make it clear to them that they are either a part of the problem or part of the solution. And I think most of the problems we experience is ignorance, people not really understanding how they're contributing or how they aren't contributing. So that's my presentation. I would like to, entertain questions and get some feedback from you as to how you all think you can sort of take the information from this conference and, in a real tangible way, bring it to your communities or your own work, if that's an acceptable question. Anybody have any ideas on that? Yes?
As you know, the United Farm Workers, they have a little video tape.
Yeah.
And it's on grapes.
Right.
That's one way that I constantly, just give them out or show them to groups.
Right.
And then bumper stickers, of course, you can always put bumper stickers, like we have one that says "No Grapes Again."
Right.
And then T-shirts. But politically, I think, and educationally, we just have to educate the masses. That's the problem, because we're so used to like sitting home, waiting for all the goods to come in, and then you just don't worry about who brings in the bacon, as they say.
Right. The question is how you can get more people involved in your communities, through churches, through schools, etc. And I think the pesticide issue is a good area to confront people on the toxics issue because there are real solutions. EPA itself has a booklet called IPM in the Schools. which they'll provide free to anyone. And it literally provides a process for getting pesticides out of the schools. IPM is a strange phrase, because integrated pest management, because it's one of those terms that's like sustainable, that's been embraced by everybody. I mean, you worked in agriculture, and in agriculture everyone loves IPM, right? They all refer to IPM as the solution, and yet they're using as many pesticides as they were before that phrase came up. So you've got to be careful with the terms people use and really find out what exactly is going on wherever you're having a discussion on pesticides.
Jay, can you clarify something? I was at the hearing yesterday and really appreciated and supported the position you took, and was seething when Lynn Goldman responded to I think one of your questions, or
Yeah.
tried a dialogue with you. How can the Clinton administration support weakening the Delaney clause, yet in her words want to strengthen the law?
Yeah.
That was a hypocritical
Well,
statement.
it's
And
extremely
I was wondering what
hypocritical.
else Clinton had up his sleeve besides weakening Delaney and allowing economic impacts into that.
Well, I think on that issue, it's very clear cut. There is not, you cannot find one industry group in this country that will support the Delaney clause. Whether it's a
Neither does
food,
Clinton.
right, whether it's a food processor, or it's food production, or a chemical company, or the sprayers, the aerial applicator, everyone. So Clinton doesn't want to buck that what he views as overwhelming support for reform of the Delaney clause. On the other hand, he wants to speak to the environmental concern that he senses among the public. The way they've crafted that strategy is to throw out a meaningless phrase. And what they throw out is, we want a health-based standard. They used to say, if we'd had the same meeting yesterday, if we'd had that meeting 3 years ago, they would have said, well, we are promoting a negligible risk standard. But they've realized that negligible risk has gotten bad press, because they're in a community where there ain't no thing as negligible risk. This is the high-risk area. You're in the state that has the highest risk of all states across the country. Now, how can you call that negligible? It doesn't make sense. So they've dropped the term negligible as a marketing tool for dealing with the response to, in effect, the chemical companies and the whole chemical company structure, and they've thrown out the term health-based. What does that mean? Well, on the one hand, it means we're not going to consider benefits when we register pesticide. We're not going to, for instance, figure out a health risk and then weigh that against the benefits and then recalculate what acceptable exposure is. We are going to develop an acceptable disease rate, and then if that disease rate is exceeded, we will stop the use of that chemical. HR 1627, for instance, just to put the Clinton administration, compare it to some of the more radical pollution proposals. The HR 1627, we have a fact sheet on that, says we will always weigh death rates, disease rates against the benefit we view those chemicals as having. And there's no limit on, we don't want to make a predetermined limit as to what an acceptable disease rate is. We really have to take it on a case-by-case basis and figure out, for instance, we don't believe you can grow wheat in this country, or tomatoes, or whatever, without carcinogenic pesticides. Therefore, we're going to accept a very high risk, because we need wheat and we need tomatoes. So from that standpoint, the Clinton administration has differentiated itself from the radical pollution pushers. The question then comes down to is what's wrong with a health-based standard. The issue then ultimately comes down to what's wrong with it? Risk assessment. Risk assessment is what's wrong with the health-based standard, because what will drive the standard is this whole discussion we've had, and the inadequacies of what that's. If they're not willing to say a finding of adverse impact triggers a phase out of the chemical, whether it's it's a national goal in the case, let's say you identify a product or a service that cannot be carried out or produced without the use of a deadly chemical. Then what you do is you put your resources into finding all the alternatives, and you phase it out over time. That's what they've done with CFCs, ozone depleters. They've just made a determination that over the long term, we as a society cannot exist with ozone depleters. And so you get rid of them. And because industries are so dependent on them, you do it over a period of time, a reasonable period of time, in which you give the alternative an opportunity to take hold. But in the pesticide area, they don't, despite the viability of organic, which has shown itself on a commercial level to be viable in virtually every crop, there is a culture of thinking that has been effectively promoted by the chemical industry that we will not eat, we will starve in this country unless we have access to these deadly chemicals. So I think you're right. I didn't choose to use that forum as an opportunity to debate her because I've done it in other forums, and I felt the time was sort of limited there. But it's political speak, and it is not responsive to the concerns that people have, which is, let's get rid of this stuff. We don't need it. You've got to put your resources into alternatives. EPA has set up an environmental stewardship program under its pesticide program, and they're having that same problem in that program. Okay. And in that program, environmental stewardship, they're talking, the buzzword is reduced risk and reduced use secondarily. And there's not enough effort being put into shifting into alternatives that do not rely on these chemicals. That's where we have to put our energies, I think. Well, how's everyone? Yes, go ahead.
I would make you aware, if you don't know, Louisiana now has a organic farmer certification program through the Louisiana Department of Agriculture. There's about 15 farmers now certified. I urge you in any way possible to support those people that are trying. Either, some can only get transitional organic certification because despite the fact they haven't sprayed their land for 20 years, there's still traces of DDT and DDE and endosulfan in their soils.
Right.
But they are working very hard towards establishing an organic farmers market in Baton Rouge. Also one in New Orleans starting in this fall. I understand from Peter Grandy there's also some money still available for free soil testing for farmers that are interested in getting certification. Please contact him. Encourage the farmers you know to head in that direction, and even if they're not completely there, I think in the state as chemically active as Louisiana is, any step in the right direction is important.
One thing that's going on at USDA, I'll close it up after this. One thing going on is an effort in USDA to try to get the school lunch program and other feeding programs to use organic food. That's something you can work through your school systems. I mean, there are tangible things you can do like that support organic agriculture directly. And to the extent that that is going on, it creates a market. Once conventional growers see the market, they're going to be there. They're going to be there trying to cash in as well. So we've got to create some economic incentives in this as well. And there are tremendous opportunities in the organic area. So thank you all for coming, and thanks for spending your weekend doing this stuff. And we look forward to working with you. Any questions, you've got my phone number on that literature. Please feel free to give us a call. If you want to pursue some of these ideas in your communities, we can help you on a specific pest problem basis or on a site basis, and we'd be happy to work with you and through Lean or directly through us to help do that. If you need more literature, more brochures, you can get in touch with us and we'll get them to you. Great, thank you.
I think we can very quickly make it a quick one so we can move ahead. Thank you for coming.
Bamboola 2000 is a unique music and dance experience that celebrates the cultural contributions of Congo Square here in New Orleans. Would you please put your hands together and welcome Bamboola 2000.
Mona, Mona, Mona.
Bamboola 2000, a musical and visual experience. Bamboola is very excited to be here with you today. We support your efforts as Southern women and men in support of our rights to keep these. And we have a way of doing it. We thank you. In Africa, the drum has a strong healing power, and the drum is called upon for all types of healing. So we appreciate your recognizing the importance of the drum in your celebration. The cowrie shells that the women wear are a source of power or used as a source of femininity. They've been used for divination. So in our African tradition, we invite you to celebrate with us as we do Jola, the dance of the Jola people in Hong Kong, the dance of the Jola people. Now in Africa, there's no stage and no audience. So you all have already gotten into it by participating, so just keep it up and we'll come get a few of you. All known for a long time that what we do to the environment will eventually come back to haunt us. Africans are the original recyclers. There are no garbage trucks. They don't need them. We as Americans now have to learn that. So continue your efforts. Bamboola supports you. All thanks and praise to the Creator.
We're going to do a rhythm now that's called lambans. Everybody say lamban. Lamban. It's from the Bamboola people of West Africa. One of the purposes of this rhythm is that it is a dance and a rhythm of healing. So we're going to leave you with this one, lamban. Boy, she shook up there.
Now, you're going to follow that?
To rebut what the Angels Fear to Tread lady from San Francisco had to say. I am one of those women who proudly wears that damn pink ribbon. And let me tell you, if it tells one person, please go get a mammogram, think about your breast, then I don't care how much money the ribbon company has made off of me. Because if it saved one life, and that life might be my daughter's, then it's worth it. I don't think that just because Hallmark started Mother's Day to make money, that mothers should not be honored or cared about. There was allusions to several groups, and I'm not going to stand up here and even address whether the things were right or wrong. I'm going to assume that everything the other speaker said was absolutely true, positively true. That all the funding of these different organizations is there. But I will match anybody's contribution and help to breast cancer with the Komen Foundation's funding of other organizations. And I can stand up here because I have talked to every one of you in the last day and a half and offered this money to you and to your organization. Not to Komen, not to this elite group, but to anybody in this audience at this conference that has a proposal. And I didn't care if it was typed and written by an attorney. I said, put it on a 5x7 card and we may fund you. Do not let a project go by that can help the people of the state of Louisiana for a lack of funds. Now maybe we're not as educated in the roles of the environment in this. As I said yesterday, I have a master's degree in biochemistry, But I'm not a scientist. But let me tell you, I can raise a hell of a lot of money. And I can see that that money gets into the hands of people who are going to be helped by it. While the others, such as the speaker, does what she does best. And that is go and fight the chemical companies, fight the environmental polluters, and everyone else. But to stand up here and to say that every group who is fighting this doesn't have a place and a purpose and a right to do the work they're doing, to me, was an affront to this conference. And that's my personal view, but we have all worked equally hard, none more than any other. And we should all have the right to do the work the way we have decided is best for ourselves and how we can be the most efficient. And like I say, that's a personal thing, and maybe I should have addressed it to her personally, one-on-one. We're both survivors. She has one attitude about being a survivor, I have another.
Hello, my name is Ana Fadas. I'm originally from South Texas, and I'm here in Baton Rouge with my husband. What I wanted to say was, I found out a couple of weeks ago that my father has asbestos poisoning, and he's had it for 25 years. I've known of skin cancer, and we have projects in Texas somewhat similar to what's here. But what I've seen today is that we have 250,000 Hispanics in New Orleans. And I would like to see a liaison for them. I know they're out there, and a lot of them knew, but we need someone to actually work the community. And I would like to see that from one of our organizations here. And the second thing is that we are still working. I've done work with the United Farm Workers, and we are still working on that no grapes. It isn't dead. We're still here, and we do need your help. We don't want anybody even thinking of eating grapes. And I saw on the second level that we had grapes out on the table. So please, please remember these people. When our plants left South Texas, they went to Mexico. And now we have maquiladora plants out there with children out there in the filth. And they're working on the other side because we don't have OSHA over there. We have OSHA here, but our regulations are not strong enough. And that was something else that wasn't addressed. My father was an employee of a plant for 25 years. Now, whether the plant knew, the union knew, whatever, we still need that worker in that plant protected. And even though, yes, they provide jobs and whatever, but they also bring death. And at what? At the blood of the employees that are in that plant, the community, we have these people thriving. What is left? Maybe 100 years from now, you're still going to have plants out there. But if we don't get together now, we won't be able to save our next generation. Because I'm a product from, God only knows, what I'm going to get. If my father has this, plus along with my mother having breast cancer before. So we don't know. So I just want to remind you that the fight for the farm workers is still there, and our employees in our plants do need help, and they do want to help. But then again, they also need a job. But we've got to find other ways, because we don't want death either. And please help us get a Latino liaison or whatever, because I know we have a lot of Cubans in New Orleans, and we've got a lot of everything everywhere. But we do need somebody out there speaking for us too. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Pam Ransom, and I'm with We Do with the Cancer Campaign. And I just wanted to take a minute to say I came down here in March for the first time when this was in the planning stages, and there were perhaps 30 people in the room. And you know, it's really exciting to see that now there are 300 people in the room. And I think it's really important that this just be a beginning of the process here. We've been meeting with women all over the country, as was mentioned earlier, who are beginning to become active on this issue. And in Albuquerque, for instance, they had a similar set of events, a hearing and then a conference. And following that, the women kept meeting and they kept staying together, and every month they meet and do just one thing. Each month they decide on one action that they're going to take. And I think that's a really good model for what can come out of this process, because you know, if it's 300 people all writing a letter about a bill or getting educated about an action that's taking place, I think that can be the basis of real change. We also, as Joan mentioned earlier, have started this health and environmental justice coalition, and as part of that effort talked about wanting to set up health and environmental justice committees in various communities. And I think that this would, as I say, be a real beginning for that process here. So I'd like to say that on behalf of We Do, we'd like to provide any kind of support to that effort that we can.
I just want to say something very quickly, just to remind people that this is a series of conferences that are taking place all over the country, and people from a whole variety of different walks of life are coming together, building bridges, learning how to communicate with each other, talk to each other, build common strategies. And so we are all part of this bigger movement that is happening across this country. We have to really maintain the relationships, as Pam said today, and really continue to build the bridges with each other. Don't forget that there were 3 conferences happening in the southern region this year, and the culminating conference, which is now turning into a national culmination of all the different events that are taking place, is in Atlanta. It's the last weekend of October, and the National Black Women's Health Project and Greenpeace and other organizations are organizing down there, and there are scholarships available to get you there. So if you're interested, it'd be a really great way to meet with other folks from around the country that are working on the same issues that you are right here in the New Orleans area. Thanks. And we're here to help too. Thanks.
Got birthday.
Go Albert. I have one thing to say. I want to make an acknowledgement to those who have the grassroots organizations like Lean and Deep South, for people who are in these rural communities to come out to workshops like this. It makes a commitment to those who don't understand and did not know about breast cancer, did not know about the health problems in the environment. And as a grassroots activist advocacy in the communities and rural areas, because of you all like Lean, we were able to bring 22 people here today. And 12 of those people were youth, and the other 10 was adults. But because of networking, partnership, we must continue on to continue building that foundation, because we do have problems, and we are noticing the problems. Now, I'm not going to say how long it's going to take for you to get the problem solved. But then I have to remind the Psalm 27, wait on the Lord and stay in good courage. That's what I need to do. Thank you very much.
I would like to thank Mary Lee. I would like for y'all to join me. Particularly for staying today. And I thank you too for bringing up new ideas, for challenging old ideas, for not agreeing or disagreeing respectfully, but for helping our knowledge grow and on our very important journey of how to protect our nurture all parts of that. I want to let you know we have been doing a lot of the administrative work, and we've been happy to do that. We'll make sure that everyone receives a list of who's been here and any other information that is relevant. And also, we'll be thinking about another event. We get together and join hands, continue on in this journey that we're going to win as women. Thank you. Thank you. Now, you said, didn't you say bye? Yeah, I said bye.